Today we're going to be talking about infectious dispositions as they arise and are defined in the infectious disease ontology, which is imported to the virus infectious disease ontology and other sub-ontologies. Here's a general overview of several of the terms that you might find in the infectious disease ontology core, in the ontology of general medical science, and from BFO, etc. These are sort of like ground floor or background terms that are used in the virus infectious disease ontology. We're going to go through a couple here and others elsewhere. So in particular, we'll focus on pathogenic and infectious dispositions, starting with the first because it's the parent class of infectious dispositions. So before we begin, it's worth noting that pathogen should be understood as indexed to either a species or stages in the developmental cycle of a species, and this is because some microbes are pathogenic to immature or developing organisms, but not to the mature versions. This is, for instance, frequent in plants. On the other hand, a pathogen for one species need not be pathogenic to all species. Some things infect, or some things cause disorder in one group of organisms, but not others. So we index. Now, the virus infectious disease ontology imports the following term from the infectious disease ontology, which is pathogenic disposition, which is, as you can see, a pretty lengthy definition. I'm going to go through the parts of this in turn. So first to note, it's a disposition. What we mean by this is following the basic formal ontology top-level architecture. A disposition is a sort of property that is internally grounded in the material constitution of some entity. This is in contrast to roles. They're contrasted in the sense that roles are externally grounded. I think concrete example to illustrate would be helpful. So salt is disposed, for instance, to dissolve, and this is a part of its lattice structure. It's due to the lattice structure of salt. Whenever salt dropped into water, for instance, that's not supersaturated, it will in fact break down, and its structure is disposed to do that. On the other hand, a role is something like a student. A student who is enrolls in a university is a student insofar as they're in this context, but this is not part of their material structure. It's not like due to the material composition of a person that they are a student. They can lose the role, for instance, without any change to their material structure. Contrast this with salt. If salt were no longer soluble, it would have to do with some change about the lattice structure of salt. The claim here is that pathogenic dispositions, these are born by material entities, and they are internally grounded. They're part of the material structure, or like doing or owing to the material structure of that material entity. And the dispositions here are to establish, or one of them is to establish localization in an organism. Now, what does this mean? So I'll use an example to illustrate. Opportunistic pathogens. We have lots of these sorts of things in humans. Staphylococcus aureus is a common example. What this means, this opportunistic aspect, is these things are pathogens when the environment changes enough for a manifestation of a pathogenic disposition. This is how we understand opportunistic pathogens in the ontology. Staphylococcus aureus is a pathogen, according to this account, not because it gets the opportunity, not because it's like in a new environment. It's not like a student, right? Like it's not a student, or it's not a pathogen because it's like in the right context. It always had the disposition to cause or to localize and cause disorder, but it's just not in the right environment to manifest that, to make it happen. Again, salt. Like salt is the analogy. Like salt doesn't always dissolve or manifest dissolving, but when it's in like water, it does. Same with Staphylococcus aureus, same with other opportunistic pathogens with respect to pathogenicity. Now, this disjunctive clause of producing toxins that can be transmitted to organisms, this is important because we want to be able to account cases like C. botulinum. This entity produces toxins, spores, and if they're ingested, this leads to serious disorder. And indeed, C. botulinum, if it's ingested in infants, because of the pH balance in infants' stomachs, C. botulinum can thrive, it can multiply, it can produce toxins, and that toxin production can lead to disorder in infants. This is surely a pathogenic behavior, and researchers speak of it this way, but it's not C. botulinum just localizing in some entities. Like it just produces poison and can be ingested. And that causes disorder. So we wanted to wanted to cover both of these cases, hence the disjunction. Now, in addition, when we talk about causing disorder, we don't want to just restrict it to the organisms that are like housing or hosting the pathogen in question. So we open this up to not just that organism, but also immunocompetent members of the organism's species. This is because we have cases like this that we'd like to cover as pathogenic. So HIV-1, it may localize in a host that has a CCR5 mutation. That mutation blocks the generating of disorder in the host. It does not mean, though, that HIV can't localize and cause disorder in other humans. It's just that this is sort of an outlier case, right? Some humans have a sort of native resistance to it. Similarly with P. falciparum, it may localize in hosts with sickle cell trait and block transition to malaria, but it might also localize in hosts without this trait. And we do speak of these two entities as pathogens, as human pathogens, and so that additional clause, that immunocompetent clause in the definition of pathogenic disposition, allows us to count these even while there are as pathogenic, even while there are cases of mutations that block the manifestations of the disorder in hosts. Now, this pathogenic disposition term is the parent term to infectious disposition, which is what we're kind of mostly interested in when we're talking about viruses. This is also imported from the infectious disease ontology. Now, what differentiates infectious dispositions from pathogenic dispositions is things that have this disposition are also disposed to be transmitted to hosts and become part of infections in the host or immunocompetent members of the species. I'll walk through again just like last time. So SARS-CoV-2 is a good example that checks all these boxes. Not only does it localize and cause disorder in humans, it adheres to cells with ACE2 receptors, and leads to all sorts of disease. But it's also disposed to transmit to hosts and become part of an infection. It's like airborne, it's part of the replication cycle that it finds new bodies, and it causes infections in hosts. Infection, this is imported from the infectious disease ontology. This is just a material entity. It's part of an organism whose extended organism has some pathogen as part, and that pathogen participates in the formation of the material entity by infecting the organism. Now, returning to C. botulinum, this doesn't, according to our definition, bear an infectious disposition to humans. It's not disposed to be transmitted to them. Children, like infants who accidentally eat honey, for instance, that has botulinum, it's not part of the life cycle of C. botulinum to accidentally be eaten by children, right, or by infants. Even so, it can still localize and produce toxins, and so it's pathogenic. But it's not disposed to be transmitted. It may even become part of an infection, although the verdict's still out. Researchers talk both ways about botulinum. We're kind of open-ended on that. We could allow, according to these definitions, that C. botulinum cause infection or become part of infection. But nevertheless, it's not going to count as an infectious entity because infectious entities in these ontologies have to be disposed to both infect and be part of infections. This, again, we have this qualification here, this disjunctive qualification. This is, again, to countenance these sorts of cases, HIV and P. falciparum. They're both infectious. They may not generate infection, they may not generate disorder. We still want to call them infectious. In most humans, typically speaking, they will cause infection, and they will cause disorder. Just summary, again, we'll talk about several of these other terms later.